Welcome to my presentation of Spiritual Direction with Ralph Waldo Emerson. He's always been a spiritual hero of mine. I met him in an American literature class at a Christian Science parochial college. And in that class, I asked an impertinent question while reading the Oversoul. I said, "Is there a religion that goes along with this philosophy?" The teacher kind of gave me a knowing glance and said, "I think there are some Unitarians out there." And that is literally how I became a Unitarian Universalist. And so I'm really looking forward to doing some spiritual direction with Ralph Waldo Emerson with you. Some quick facts about Ralph Waldo Emerson. He began his career as a Unitarian minister. It was kind of an expectation that he would become one. But at a pivotal moment in his life, which we'll explore in a moment, he shifted to a life of letters and lecturing and poetry and writing. He was a founder of the Transcendentalist movement and the American Romantic Literary movement. And I like this one. He was the grandson of the first military chaplain to serve in the Revolutionary War. Some key ideas, which we'll again explore as we get into spiritual direction. This inseparableness of God from the world. He's sometimes called a pantheist, but I like to see his life as he begins with Christianity. He never really abandons it. He abandons the church, but he just keeps adding concepts of divinity and holiness to his understanding of God in the world. Primacy of individual experience is key for him. Direct experience of God without a mediation of the church or a person or a text. You experiencing God. And of course, self-reliance and rugged individualism and all those things that we learned in high school. There's a very specific time when I'm thinking of starting spiritual direction with Ralph Waldo Emerson. And that's between 1832 and 1836. 1827, Emerson does some supply preaching in Concord, meets a young woman named Ellen Tucker, falls in love. 2 years later, they're married. That same year, he becomes ordained as a Unitarian minister and gets his first church, and everything seems to be okay until 2 years later, she dies of tuberculosis. Emerson is bereft. He is out of his mind. There's a story of him opening her tomb and throwing himself into her crypt. His friends kind of pack him up, cart him off to Europe for 10 months to get right again. 1834, he moves to Concord. Year after that, he remarries. And then 1836, he publishes Nature and really is launched into the Emerson that we know today. So what happened between 1832 and 1836 where he realigns and reorients himself? I would love to be a spiritual director during that time. So where would I begin spiritual direction with Ralph Waldo Emerson? To this point, as Barry and Connolly write, he's not the best candidate for spiritual direction. Has been afraid of life's joys and pains. He has struggled with when something knocks him down. He has a hard time getting up. He struggles with what we would call today depression, back then melancholia. He's had some close relationships with other people, but not the deep friendships that he would later develop. But he does have an overwhelming desire for something more in his relationship with God. He wants to understand God better and really spends the rest of his life moving in that direction. So what am I going to do with Waldo? First of all, we're going to start off with a lot of active listening. He's going to need to unpack a lot. I'm going to need to not interrupt very much. I'm going to need to just be there with him in a way that perhaps nobody ever has been. I'm going to think about creating some good contemplative space for him. He's very used to being in his head. He has spent his life from early childhood on being a writer and a reader, being very quiet. People would say of him that no matter what happened, they didn't really know what was going on inside of him. And so moving to some heart space may take some intentionality through creative ritual making. That could include how we gather, how we craft prayer to open our time together, where we meet. Naming his touchstone experiences, going back into his childhood, especially those outside the church, because he's telling me in our early sessions that he's done with it. He no longer wants to deliver the Lord's Supper. He has a problem with communion. He's got a whole laundry list of concerns and complaints about the church. And so with his deep desire to know God, I want to know where in his earlier life, outside the church, he's encountered God and a movement of the Spirit, his heart cracking open, all those good things. As well, when he's ready to dip back into the church and see, has there been something there as well that has moved him to this place? I want to explore with him what desires and expectations were or weren't being fulfilled by a life of traditional ministry. Everything in his biography suggests that it was kind of expected that he would become a minister. And so moving him into just exploring other options for his vocation and call are really going to be important. And then I will look with him for images of God in nature and nature in God. I suspect that our early sessions are going to be talking all about nature and his experiences out walking around and getting to know God's world. So what are his touchstone experiences? He was born into a prominent New England family. The Emersons were well known, but the death of his father when he was 8 sent the family into poverty and a lot of displacement and a lot of movement. What sustained his spirit in those times? What stories does he carry with him about how he survived, how he thrived, what were struggles? What has sparked his imagination to see God everywhere, as he's telling me in our spiritual direction sessions? I wonder if Emerson has ever thought about what God desires for him. He's got a brilliant mind, a hunger for experience, literary talent, and he experiences a lot of isolation in his life. What does God desire for him? What is God inviting Emerson to leave behind for that desire to be fulfilled? I'm going to ask him, did ministry feel like a celebration of your experience and your talents? He might have some answers for me. And of course, I'm going to let him come to those as much as I'm able. And more than anything, where has he seen God? He's talking to me in spiritual direction about other texts that he's read, some Buddhist stuff, some Islamic stuff. He's questioning, is God there? Where is God? And I'm going to keep him talking, keep him digging into those ways. At their best, these traditions, these feelings are new ways of learning to love. Walter Burkhardt calls contemplation a long, loving look at the real. Contemplation is communion. It's the discovery of holy in deep, thoughtful encounters with God's creation, with God's people. And so as Waldo and I start to craft our time together, I would ask him where he wants to meet. He keeps talking about nature and being outside and taking walks down to Walden Pond. And so I might ask him, let's walk down to Walden Pond if you'd like to have our time outside, since it seems so integrative for him. I would ask him, of course, why is all this important to you? I would trust that since it's not his first time having conversations with God and praying, it's not his first rodeo as a minister. I would trust that it's not his first time encountering the holy. I would explore successful practices that he has had in his experience in his relationship with God. When has he felt grounded? And when has he felt consolation? When has he felt loved and at peace? And I would also have some curiosity around when has he felt unhinged or out of place? When have things been challenging for him? He might be the kind of person that has a hard time talking about the challenges. And so opening up that contemplative space where he feels safe and affirmed in bringing his vulnerable self would be super important for a very reserved person like Ralph Waldo Emerson. I would explore with him the shifting ideas of community. He's been so church-based. He's been so congregational in his experience of life. Where is he going to find community now if he decides to move away from that contemplative space of the church? Who would be the new congregants for him? Of course, as we know, the Transcendentalist Club and he was very good later on in life at creating intentional community. What are some barriers for creating this space? Depression. He describes deep periods of melancholy, and so we're going to talk about boundaries in a minute, but it's definitely going to be there and a barrier. And things I want to watch: resistance and fear based on social expectations, which were, of course, in the 19th century, and for someone coming from a prominent social position, probably significant for him. As Frederick Marsh so eloquently describes that experience of you looking at God and God looking at you, Emerson, in one of our earliest sessions, has this idea of being completely transparent to God. That's his way of describing this movement between God's gaze and your own. Emerson writes, "I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing and I see all." And it's an experience he had in the woods, just feeling completely seen and embraced by nature and a direct experience of God. And so, who is God to Waldo? Who is Waldo to God? He really starts, as we work together, he starts to see himself as part of God and part of God's creation, and completely divine and holy as he was created. And this is a great breakthrough for our spiritual direction. As we learn about each other, and I learned more about Ralph Waldo Emerson, he describes seeing the divine throughout religious traditions and other cultures. And of course, he has questions about his own Christianity, probably, and what that means to be a Christian and having these direct experiences and having a new reverence for other ideas. He finds holiness in community, but keeps searching for new human connections. He seeks relief, and this comes up probably a lot in our conversations, relief from his clinging to disordered attachments, his grief, his feelings about organized religion, his commitment to justice and abolition, and those ideas of the day that really have captured his imagination. And although Emerson has this unique ability to, especially in his day and age, to see God in all things, he has also struggled to fit his desires and see them as God's desires into this divine oneness that he's cultivating in his larger theological understanding of the universe. And so he keeps seeking that, understanding of who God is for Waldo and what God says back about who Waldo is to God. Of course, as his spiritual director, I'm going to be kind of seeding some ideas about prayer practices that he might want to explore or check out. The nature prayer is going to be his probably primary for him. It is, and we learn about him later in life. It is primary for him, and it's his primary connection to God. He writes about his touchstone experiences. He journals constantly. He's been journaling since he was 5 years old. So these are prayer practices that are just part and parcel of his daily life. And coming to see them as prayer might be something that is revelatory for him. Wow, these are prayers as powerful as anything the church has put together. Lectio Divina, we might explore a little bit of that, going back into some of those texts that he's pushed away in the Christian tradition and maybe exploring them again through creative and imaginative and Ignatian ways. Music prayer, not quite as easy to turn on the phonograph in the 19th century, but certainly going to concerts would be a great way for, and he loved music and bringing musicians into his own home. Body prayer, he walks constantly with friends, such as Thoreau later on. Praying in darkness, we're gonna have to be careful with some of the grief and depression, and as his spiritual director, I'm going to be asking him to explore where the darkness encounters the light in his daily prayer life. The examen could be helpful to him. He's probably doing a lot of analysis in his head and a lot of sorting and stacking and categorizing. But the examen as a practice could help him pay attention to all of life, to the grief and the suffering and the joy and their interactions in a disciplined way. Art, not sure that I would recommend art as prayer for Emerson. I can't see him doing finger paints or sculpture, getting his hands dirty with clay. Just probably not his cup of tea. Just some final thoughts on why I think I would be a good spiritual director for Ralph Waldo Emerson. In addition to being his biggest fanboy, which I would probably have to keep in check, set a good boundary there. I do think that my background and experience in multi-faith and interfaith dialogue and conversations and texts would leave my heart open to hearing his really radical and revolutionary ideas about God and that transparency that he describes between himself and the universe and all that is divine and all that is holy. I would love to encourage those conversations with him and let him just explore and feel held and seen, not by me, but seen by God in those moments where he is exploring really this divine revelation that he's experiencing throughout his whole life. We would probably return to some ideas and concepts over and over again. Self-care, setting good boundaries. He tended to get overwhelmed with social engagements, and so creating contemplative space where we can honor that need to recharge and to return to the sources of his own spiritual groundedness is going to be something we just keep going back over and over again. And trusting God's guidance to balance the life of the mind and the thoughts with the direct experience that seem to feed his soul, and then celebrate the way those come together in his writing and his poetry and in his ideas. It would be an amazing experience. And of course, as I do spiritual direction with people along their life's journey, you just never know when you're going to have a Ralph Waldo Emerson in the chair beside you. Thanks for doing this presentation with me.